Happy Friday. Timur Urkov, Preach. We'll be talking about hurricanes today. Hey, Brian, how you doing?
Okay, how are you?
Good, good. That was a super smooth login. That was like the fastest anyone's ever logged into my interview. So I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
no problem.
Anyway, listen, thanks for joining us. I'm just going to do a quick introduction while everyone's logging on. So Norcross is one of the world's most respected hurricane experts. Um, he talk about experience. His first hurricane coverage was in 1969. In 1980, he graduated from Florida State University with a master's degree in meteorology and broadcasting, and then joined CNN as their first weekend weathercaster. After jobs in San Francisco and Atlanta, Bryan was on television in Miami for 25 years as an anchor and as director of meteorology for ABC. Despite all these amazing accomplishments, he really got famous during his coverage of Hurricane Andrew back in 1992, when he was known as the man who talked South Florida through one of the worst hurricane disasters in U.S. history. This led to his work on NBC and CBS News as a hurricane analyst from 96 to 2008. In appreciation for his work during Hurricane Andrew, amazingly, he was publicly recognized with designations of Bryan Norcross Days, very cool, in Miami, Miami Beach, and Fort Lauderdale. In addition, he's been the recipient of an Emmy Award, the DuPont and Peabody Awards as well. After working with America's Emergency Network, Bryan joined the Weather Channel as senior hurricane specialist in 2010. In 2018, he returned to Miami as the hurricane specialist here for ABC. Notably, Bryan was profiled in the New York Times following his coverage of Hurricane Sandy, where the New York Times quoted him as the most trusted hurricane human on the planet. So he's here to discuss the 2021 hurricane season. Bryan, it's great to have you on with us. And again, thanks for your time.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It's good to be with you.
Awesome. So we'll just start with the basics here, just for the layperson. When exactly is hurricane season?
Well, officially, it starts June 1st. There was some talk about moving it back into May because we've had year after year now, 7 years in a row with a storm forming before June 1st. But they're generally not very consequential storms, and so the decision was made to keep the hurricane season at June 1st, and it goes through November 30th. But August, September, and October are the bulk of the storms. As a matter of fact, for South Florida, the middle of August to the third week in October really is just by far the highest likelihood of having a significant hurricane.
Yeah, I mean, like that's like prime time hurricane season. What
Mm-hmm.
what makes prime time hurricane season? Is it the water temperature? Is it the air temperature? Is it both? Is it wind currents?
It's a combination of the general wind pattern over the tropical Atlantic or over the Atlantic and the water temperature. So all summer long, the strong sun beats on the ocean warms up, but then the ocean starts cooling off in September. But it's still quite warm, and you have favorable upper air conditions, just the way the jet stream kind of averages. Jet stream moves north in the summer and moves south in the winter. So when the jet stream moves south, that kind of cancels the hurricane. It moves north, and it just takes longer for that to happen. So they kind of maximize each other. It's the water is still quite warm, but the wind profiles in the atmosphere are most favorable in September. So that's why it's middle of August to middle to third week of October. That's the peak.
Got you. Now, tell us a little bit. What exactly, or why does a hurricane form, and what strengthens a hurricane and what weakens a hurricane?
Well, a hurricane forms because just the right conditions in the atmosphere come together, much like any kind of storm. So you have to have a disturbance for the hurricane to form. So if you have some kind of disturbance that gets the air lifting more than spinning, actually, because when air lifts in the atmosphere, if you take the air that's near the ocean and you lift it up, then air kind of comes in below to fill it, right? You created a kind of a vacuum. So now you have air coming from all directions to fill that space. And so because the earth is spinning, that creates some spin in the air. And then if the atmospheric conditions around that spin are right to allow the air to continue to rise in an efficient kind of way, then you can get a deeper spin, deeper spin, deeper spin, and eventually you start getting a tropical depression. And then again, the atmospheric conditions have to stay right over an extended period of time. And that's why we get a lot of disturbances, 70, 75 disturbances, depends on the year, but say 60 to 80 disturbances come off of Africa and move across the ocean. But most of them don't develop because the atmospheric conditions aren't sufficient for them to maintain their rotation and to grow in the atmosphere. It's just there's too much upper level wind. The winds at the surface are going the wrong direction compared to the upper level winds. The vortex that tries to form tilts over and so forth. So only periodically do all those conditions come together, and some years, more often they come together, and some years less often they come together. And if the ocean water temperature is warmer than average, on average, you get more lifting of the air, so more of these things can be more robust when a disturbance moves off of Africa and comes across the Atlantic. They have more lift because warm air rises. So if the ocean is cooler, you don't get as much lift, fewer storms form in general. And then there are other factors that kind of modulate hurricane seasons too, make them go up and down.
Now, why does a hurricane weaken over land? Is that strictly because of it lacks the water temperature, or is it the moisture and the humidity?
Well, it's usually both. So the hurricane is driven by the heat of the ocean. That's the fuel. So if you take that fuel away, then it'll start to spin down. It doesn't have that source of continuing energy. But in places like South Florida, when the Everglades are wet, there's a lot of water out there, and that water is also quite warm. And so you don't get the weakening when a hurricane comes over South Florida. As a matter of fact, in the case of Andrew, it actually continued to strengthen for a bit after it came ashore, because remember, it's atmospheric conditions and the water temperature. So moves over South Florida, where you have a lot of water under part of the circulation, and if the atmospheric conditions continue to come together, it can actually intensify for a bit before friction takes over, because that's the other thing that happens over land, is that the air at the surface, where we actually measure the wind, is encountering the land. There's friction there. The rougher the land, it's called the roughness, then the faster it will spin down. And often, not so much in Florida, but farther north, there's dry air over the land that gets pulled into the circulation, and that's another thing that weakens it.
Got you. Take us through a little bit about how these storms are graded. Tropical depression, what does that mean? Tropical storm, category 1 through 5 hurricane. How is that kind of categorized?
Well, the categories, first of all, the categories 1 through 5, that's a later development. I'll talk about that. That came along in the early 1970s. But the delineation between these storms before they get to be a hurricane goes way back to the early 19th century, and a British admiral named Admiral Beaufort created something called the Beaufort scale that had 12 levels of wind speed, and each level came with what kind of sail you needed to put up on your sailing ship. And then there were ways to estimate based on what they saw when they looked out at the ocean, what the Beaufort number was. Well, that morphed over time to where we ended up in knots, which was what the shipping community still uses, actually, and the aviation community uses knots as a wind speed as opposed to miles per hour. So the real divisions between the tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes and so forth are really in knots. And so it's 35 knots is when you get to a tropical storm. So a tropical depression is not based on wind speed. It's only based on the fact, is there an organized circulation in the tropics that's a tropical type system that's not involved with a cold front from the north or something. It's not a northern type winter type storm. It's a tropical system powered by the heat of the ocean. And does it have an organized circulation? Then they call it a tropical depression. And they do that, and that can be any wind speed less than 35 knots. 35 knots is 39 miles per hour, so nominally 40 miles per hour is when tropical storms start. So, but if it's less than that, but it's organized, they just call it a tropical depression. And the reason they make note of it is because generally hurricanes start as tropical depressions, then go to tropical storms, then go to hurricanes. So it's, naming something a tropical depression is really like saying, okay, here's the system we got to watch. So,
Gotcha.
and so that's when advisories start. That's when the cone starts. So even though we acknowledge those are weak systems, they're not going to cause any wind damage. They can cause flood damage, but they're not going to cause any wind damage. So that's up to 35 knots, 40 miles an hour. And then it becomes a tropical storm, which goes up to 65 knots was the shipping line, which translates to 74 miles per hour. So I always just say 75 because the Hurricane Center only ever estimates, because it's always an estimate of the wind, to the 5 miles per hour anyway. So they would never designate a 74 mile an hour hurricane. They'd always designate it as 75. So basically tropical storms start at 40 and hurricanes start at 75, and they have to have organized circulation, not be associated with a cold front, is what the rules are to make it a tropical system, a tropical depression, storm, or hurricane.
And then when you go category 1 is at 75 miles an hour. And then what qualifies category 2, 3, 4, and 5?
Well, so category 1, yes, is nominally 75 miles per hour. And these categories were the system was designed by a guy named Herb Saffer, who was an engineer in Miami. And Herb was a great guy. I knew him to the end of his life, actually. And he noticed that earthquakes were ranked by the Richter scale, right? And he had the idea, working in the Caribbean, that this would be a good idea for hurricanes. So he designed a scale and he took it to Bob Simpson, who was the director of the National Hurricane Center then. This is in the early 70s. And they put it out. And that's why we call it the Saffer-Simpson scale to this day. Although now we call it the Saffer-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale, but whatever, Saffer-Simpson scale. So, so on that scale, 75 miles per hour, up to 110, that's a category, or up to 95, sorry, category 1. Category 2, anything over 95 and up to 110. Category 3, anything over 110 up to 130. Category 4, up to 155, essentially. And then anything over that's category 5.
Okay. And so when does a storm officially get named? At what point do they get named? And also, who does the naming?
So when it becomes a tropical storm, so when the sustained winds in the system are estimated to be 40 miles per hour or higher, assuming it's not hurricane strength, but when they reach 40 miles per hour, and sometimes it jumps right to a 50 mile an hour storm or something, whatever, that's when they get named. So it has to have at least 40 mile an hour winds and an organized circulation of a tropical system. The National Hurricane Center does the naming, but the names, there are actually 7 lists of names now. 6 of them rotate every 6 years. So it's the same names every 6 years, unless a storm is so strong that they take it off the list, retire the name, and they replace it. But you have those 6 lists. And now just this year, you remember last year we went to the overflow list, which was Greek letters, and they decided that was a bad idea, which it was a bad idea, because you can't retire a Greek letter. It doesn't make any sense to do that. And Eta, Zeta, Theta, and people thought that Zeta was the last of the list. And anyway, it was just confusing. And then in Spanish and other languages, it didn't really make any sense, in translation. So anyway, they went to a 7th list of names that'll only be used for overflow if and when we need that again.
Got you. And, you know, talking about 2020, so you mentioned, you know, typical hurricane season, there's about 12 named storms. Last year we had 30.
Hmm.
Why was 2020 so bad?
Well, the normal number has been updated. Now it's 14 uh, officially, but that's not really representative of what's average in a hurricane season, because that number is the average going from 1991 to 2020. Well, the technology in the 90s was nowhere near what the technology is in the 2010s. So we're just naming more storms now because we have higher resolution satellites, we have other kinds of sensing equipment. We know when there's a circulation, and these storms that only last a day or two get a name. They count in that number, but we would not have known about them. Not that the criteria has changed. The criteria is exactly the same, but we wouldn't have known about them without these modern sensing systems. So the right normal number these days, even though officially it's 14, is really probably 15, 16 is more, I think, representative of what we would think of as being normal. Now, last year for, we knew that it was going to be busy because you had two factors in play. There's three main factors in play. So the first one is that it's called the Sub-Saharan African monsoon, or the African Sub-Saharan monsoon. In other words, the amount of storminess over Africa, over the western part of Africa, south of the Saharan Desert, was forecast to be, for a variety of reasons, stormier than it had been. So that's the first factor. So those are the systems that move out over the Atlantic and become the seeds that sometimes develop in the storms. Secondly, the Atlantic was unusually warm. The tropical Atlantic was unusually warm and forecast to be quite warm. And then thirdly, and this is the biggest driver of hurricane seasons, is this Pacific phenomena called El Nino or La Nina. And El Nino it was named by Peruvian fishermen because the equator comes right into Peru. And what they would notice is that sometimes the Atlantic was just warmer than normal off Peru. And now we know that it's actually right along the equator in the Eastern Atlantic, or the Pacific, I'm sorry. The Pacific Ocean was sometimes warmer than normal, and it would goof up their fishing. And so this happened around Christmas time. That's why they called it El Nino, in other words, Jesus, the Christ child, kind of El Nino. And that's how that got named. Well, now science took over, and now we know it's a phenomena that happens every 4 to 7 years, somewhere in that kind of a cycle. And the tropical Pacific along the equator in the eastern side of the ocean gets unusually warm. And what that does is that causes the air over the Pacific to lift, right? Warm, if you have warm water, you create warm air over the ocean. That means it's going to go up. Warm air rises. So that air goes up, and it's over a relatively big area. Pacific's a big ocean. And that air has to go somewhere, and it blows over the Atlantic, and that creates unfavorable wind conditions in the upper atmosphere over the Atlantic, and we get fewer hurricanes. So when there is an El Nino, that's what we get. When we get the opposite condition, which has more recently been named La Nina, that means it's cooler than normal in the Pacific. That means you don't have those unfavorable winds in the Atlantic, and you get more hurricanes. So, and we had an El Nino last year. So we had the three factors that are the main factors all pointing up. Forecasts were all for quite a busy season. In the 20s, most of the forecasts were. Nobody forecast 30 named storms. And then, there is something else that we don't really know that happened in 2005 as well, that seemed like last year everything that started to spin suddenly spun like a top. And why that happens sometimes when the conditions look favorable for development, but not favorable for super development necessarily. We don't know that fine detail that causes a season that looks like it should have 22 or 24 storms, or to have 30 storms or something that, and then to have so many strong storms besides. We don't know that last step that caused 2020 to be hyper active. And there's only been a few seasons, 2005, 1933, that were at this extreme level of, it seemed like everything that could start went ahead and turned into a storm.
Gotcha. And so looking ahead, what's your prediction for this coming 2021? Is it going to be as bad? If so, how many named storms are you predicting personally? And of these, how many could potentially hit Florida?
Well, the conditions are not all pointing up this year, but they're not all pointing down either. So we don't have any big negatives. The African monsoon is still going to crank out tropical waves. It's active, so that's a pointing up. The Atlantic Ocean is not as warm as it was last year, so there's not as much fuel out there. Now the tropical Atlantic is never cold, so there's plenty of fuel, but not as much fuel. So we wouldn't think that everything would get going quite as well. And in the Pacific, the El Nino La Nina situation is in the neutral phase. It's not cold or warm, and so neutral years, if you go back and look at them, it's about 50-50 on whether the season is busy or not busy in a neutral year. It seems like that just becomes a non-factor, and it's based on other factors. So we would expect, because the African monsoon is busy this year and is forecast to be busy, that we would expect an above normal season, but not crazy, because we don't have all those other factors pointing up. So somewhere in the high teens, high teens to near 20, something like that.
Got you.
It feels
and what
right.
percentage? What percentage of named storms do you think end up hitting land in Florida?
Well, we don't really try to predict beyond saying that you have a landfall in Florida. The odds are that you're going to have a landfall in Florida every year. So when you have you predict slightly above normal, you have a little better chance of a landfall in Florida. Now, Florida is a big place, right? Last year, Pensacola and the Western Panhandle had a bad year, and then we had Michael a couple of years ago in Panama City. So, but obviously they didn't affect South Florida. So it's a long way from Miami to Pensacola, right?
Yeah.
So the odds of Florida getting hit are always reasonably high, but that doesn't mean South Florida. In South Florida, we average a significant storm every few years. And when I say significant, I mean impactful. 2.5 to 3 years ago.
Yeah. One of the questions,
like Wilma or Irma or something like that. Neither of those were very strong hurricanes, but they were impactful.
Yeah, exactly. Something that you have to prepare for, and people evacuate is what you're going after. One of the things that is often talked about is the effect of global warming on hurricane season. And, global warming, clearly over time, the average temperature of the planet is going up slowly. The average temperature of water overall going up slowly. It would make sense that it would increase the impact of hurricane season. Has that been studied scientifically, and is there data to actually support that?
Yeah, a lot of people have studied that, are studying that. So the first thing is that the sea level is rising. Hurricanes do most of their damage due to pushing the ocean water up over the land, and we're starting with a higher ocean just from the get-go. So the impact of global warming on hurricanes, if the storms were no different, would be increased immediately, right? So in terms of the impact on the storms, it's somewhat unknown. Yes, the ocean's getting warmer, but the effect on the atmosphere is a bit of an open question. So in terms of the numbers of storms, we're not at this point seeing it, and it's not like in the future the science is indicating, okay, the needle is going to peg or something like that. But in a warmer atmosphere, there is more moisture in the atmosphere, and therefore you expect heavier rains. There have been studies that attributed some part of the rain, Hurricane Harvey, to having a warmer atmosphere. And there's some research that indicates that hurricanes will move more slowly. So storms that move more slowly impact an area longer and do more damage. So even without storms being, net stronger, you can have effects from sea level rise and motion and moisture that cause them to be worse. And I hasten to add, by the way, that we really, in South Florida especially, have a warped perspective about what normal hurricanes are, because hurricanes used to be a lot worse. We've actually had a spell of relatively weak hurricanes affecting South Florida. I mean, Hurricane Andrew notwithstanding, obviously, but that was a small storm that didn't affect the whole region. If you go back just in the 1940s, for example, in 1945, you had the Category 4 hit just south of Miami. 47, Category 4 hit Fort Lauderdale. 48, a Category 4 hit the West Coast, came over Miami. And 49, Category 4 hit West Palm. And 1950, Category 4 hit Miami, right? In 5 out of 6 years, you had Category 4 hurricanes hitting South Florida. We haven't seen anything remotely like that. And, and then, you can talk about the 20s. The greatest hurricane of all time was 1926 that has ever hit the United States, and that was the Great Miami Hurricane. So if just the hurricanes of the past come along, let alone any changes related to global warming, we'll have a lot more hurricanes.
I mean, so you said it best. I mean, I think we've gotten very lucky. You think just a couple of years ago, Dorian, Category 5, annihilated the Bahamas, was coming straight for Miami and then went north, right? People say it's only a matter of time before a devastating Cat 5 hits Miami. I'm assuming you agree with that. It's just a matter of time before a devastating storm like Andrew or like Dorian, instead of turning north, just continues and plows into Miami.
Well, yeah, I mean, time is a long thing, right? But it's certainly odds favor in our lifetime, especially for the younger people in the audience, that there's going to be, a tremendous hurricane hitting South Florida, hitting Miami. Now, the thing is, it doesn't take a Category 5. The most damaging, what they've done is they've gone back and looked at the historic hurricanes in the record. The records go back to the middle of the 19th century. And they've analyzed what would happen if that same storm hit again. And of all the hurricanes that have hit the United States, by a significant margin, the most damaging would be the 1926 Great Miami Hurricane. That the center of the storm came in essentially Palmetto Bay today. That was the center of the eye, but downtown Miami was actually in the eye, and Miami Beach was essentially destroyed, as was Hollywood, Dania, and Fort Lauderdale. It was a giant hurricane that damaged or destroyed 95% of the buildings from Deerfield Beach to Homestead. Now, most of those buildings were concentrated in Miami at the time. 125,000 or so people lived in South Florida, most of them in Miami. But there wasn't anywhere near as much to damage, obviously, with only 125,000 people. Yeah. And things were simpler, right? So anyway, yes, the odds highly favor that, over the next 20 years, that some really significant hurricane will affect Miami and South Florida.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously were very involved in terms of Andrew. You saw the kind of devastation. People talk about that being certainly one of the top 5 most devastating hurricanes of all time. Just take us through what a category 4 or 5 direct hit on Miami looks like. Because, I certainly don't know what that looks like. Many of our viewers don't know what that looks like. Just take us through a little bit about what kind of destruction a true category 4 or 5 direct hit looks like.
Well, Hurricane Andrew was one of the very few storms that were just right there at the top of the scale. So like really weird stuff happened that only happens in super extreme hurricanes like Dorian, like Andrew. And for example, I have a picture that I got from NOAA actually of 2 cars that were parked in somebody's garage and they're both flipped over, still in the garage. Right? Or, a sheet of plywood going through a palm tree, or a 2x4 going through a palm tree, or a piece of wood, like a big splinter, going into the concrete curb. And
crazy.
Flying 2x4s went through concrete block homes, and tragically, a young girl lost her life that way in her bedroom because a 2x4 came through the concrete outer wall. That's why we tell people get to an inside area of the house, right?
Wow.
So, it happens in these ultra extreme storms that thankfully don't happen very often, but it does happen. And in Andrew, we had 17-ish feet of storm surge, Biscayne Bay essentially rising up that high. Now, it happened to occur at one of the least populated parts of all of metropolitan South Florida along the coast. So we get this massive storm surge, and it didn't have a lot of extent to it because Andrew was such a small storm physically, as opposed to the 1926 hurricane that drove the water completely over Miami Beach and way into downtown Miami and downtown Fort Lauderdale,
Wow.
because it was such a giant circulation. So you think about it, if you take in the bathtub full of water, take your hand and move it like that, you move a certain amount of water. But if you take your arm and go like that, you move a whole lot more water, right? So that's the difference between Hurricane Andrew and the water it would move. Your hand can still get a lot of water out of the tub, but not as much as if you really, swipe it, right? So Andrew moved a lot of water, but 1926 hurricane just moved so much more water over a bigger part of the coast. So what would happen? I mean, it would, these days, the difference is we have a lot of buildings that will continue to be habitable. But water, anything that's exposed to the water, like the port, if Andrew had come in farther north, it would have taken out the port of Miami, would have taken out the airport, probably, in terms of having it be functional.
Wow.
in any reasonable amount immediately. It closed anyway because of issues at the airport, but it would have taken quite some time. And you have what you don't know will happen is, and the kind of scariest thing is how many jobs are lost because infrastructure can't support them, right? What happens if the water systems and the sewer systems and the electrical systems are out for the Brickell Avenue business district for an extended period of time? Those banks and hedge funds and mortgage company, whatever they are, they've got to go work somewhere, right? They've got to continue their business somewhere. They're not going to wait for things to function in Brickell. So you have issues like that the building doesn't have to fail for businesses to have to relocate, and conceivably if they set up shop in Tampa or something,
Yeah.
do they all come back, or do they go back to New York, or what happens? It took South Dade quite a long time to recover from Hurricane Andrew.
Yeah.
They recovered in it, in a big way, but it took a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like living in the Bay Area. You know that there's going to be a devastating earthquake at some point, but you love living there, so you stay and you just realize that at some point it's going to happen. Same thing here. It's like there's no doubt that at some point there's going to be a devastating hurricane. You just got to just be ready for it. What do you recommend for all of our listeners in terms of preparing for hurricane season? What do you tell your friends and your family? What should they be doing?
Well, there's four things, really. The first thing is, where are you going to be for the hurricane, right? If you're in a high rise that's anywhere near the water, then the problem with staying there. So let's talk about a high rise on Miami Beach or Key Biscayne. The building is going to stand in any hurricane. And if you go to a inside hallway or stairwell that's not exposed to the outside, you're going to survive fine. You could take your sofa out there in the hallway and, you got all these big concrete walls in between you and the storm. You're going to be fine. The problem is that if the water covers Miami Beach or Key Biscayne or takes out part of the causeway or whatever, the roads we covered with sand in 1926 was up to 3 feet deep in Miami Beach. So you can't drive, even if your car survives up in the garage. If it's on the street, your car is toast. And you probably have, in a big storm, no power, no water, and no communications. So do you want to get stuck in your apartment with no air conditioning, no water in your building, and no prospect of really getting out until there's a lot of work done to make it accessible? So that's why anytime that's possible, that people could get stranded on the Barrier Island on the beach or Key Biscayne or on points north, that's why they order evacuations, because they don't want people stranded. It's not because there are no buildings that will survive. That's not it. So that's on the beach. If you're inland, then the question is, are you like on Brickell, where we all know it floods in a heartbeat, right? And in a significant hurricane, that'll be all deep underwater. And so again, the buildings will have no power, no water, and then communications is iffy. You just don't know, and measly Hurricane Irma, which was really a tropical storm in Miami, the AT&T network went out for all of South Florida. So communications is iffy. So the idea of, again, being stranded, you run the risk of being stranded by staying right there along the water. If you're in a high rise in Coral Gables or in some place that's away from the water, and there's a lot of high ground in South Florida, it would be okay to stay in the high rise and kind of find a safe place on, usually we say, the second or third floor. So even if the water rises outside from flooding, you're above that, but you're not exposed to the highest winds on the higher floors. The buildings are safe. So, and the other thing is that so you need a place to go. So where can you go? The best place is in a modern house, somebody's modern house in Coral Gables or some other high ground in South Florida, because as opposed to trying to get on the road and go out of town.
Yeah, right? Because last time there was an evacuation, it becomes a total disaster trying to get out of the state. And so a lot of times you're saying it's better to hunker down in a safe place locally than it is to try to get on 95 and drive up, and then the storm is chasing you, and then you're in Georgia and the storm hits Georgia.
So the issue with going, a lot of people want to go. Okay, go. That's fine, but you got to go early, and you got to know that when you go, there is a reasonable chance the hurricane is not going to hit, right? And so then, if you go early enough, you can fly. If you go 5 days before, something like that, once the cone is kind of aimed at us, just generally, then go to the airport, get on a plane, and go somewhere. Now, it may chase you. It's happened a number of times that the storm, ended up going to Orlando or Houston or someplace else. But regardless, you're more maneuverable if you go someplace else. So if you can afford to do that, then why not? Why not button up your house, your apartment, get out of town, come back when it's civilized to come back, if it does turn out to be really, really bad. But most people can't do that. Most people have to work. They have things to take care of. They've got family to deal with. They've got issues, right? So that means that you need to figure out how to stay and be safe. And that means you got to figure out how to, where to go. And the good thing is in Miami-Dade and Broward counties, and some degree in the Keys, less so in the rest of Florida, the homes, anything modern is tremendously strong and safe. You're not going to, you're going to survive in those houses. It comes down to where are we going to park the car so we have a car after the storm, because in a bad hurricane, a lot of cars don't make it that are left outside because of flying debris, trees, whatever. So you got to think about that. So first thing is the where you're going to go. The second thing is how you're going to protect your property, including your car, right? Which for most people ends up being shutters or impact windows or something. The third thing is where are you going to get the water to drink? Because most, you don't need food, and people generally think of the food, but they don't think of the water. And the easiest thing to do for water is not to go out to the store and buy a bunch of gallon jugs of water. The easiest thing to do is to go to Amazon now and order these inflatable jugs that are all squished down, and you put them on the shelf, and they're 5-gallon jugs, and then you fill them up with tap water before the storm, and you've got plenty of water.
Wow, that's common sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but people they think about the food, but they don't think about the water, and they actually need the water more than they need the food. You have to have water. And then the fourth thing is communication. So, what we suggest is that you have a communications point, Aunt Mary in New Jersey or something, and that everybody that that you want to confirm you're okay and status and stuff like that has Aunt Mary's number, so that when you can communicate, you communicate with Aunt Mary. You don't try and call everybody, because you can't generally call, and it may not be your phone that's working. It may be some phone that they have as a community phone somehow. So you just don't know what the situation is going to be. So you want to have a contact point, is the point, that your family, your friends, your relatives all know that that's where, people are going to check in.
Gotcha.
So
those are all amazing. Those are all great pieces of advice. And it seems like common sense, but whenever there's a hurricane approaching, people freak out. They don't think logically, and they start doing stupid things. So it's great to hear just kind of your key points of advice. Listen, Bryan, thank you for your time. Hopefully this year, just like you said, is a little bit quieter than last year. Last year was kind of brutal with the storms. Hopefully it's less than 30. Hopefully there's not a devastating kind of category 4 or 5 that hits us. But again, thanks for all you do. Thanks for all your work here. And again, thanks for your time. Hope you have a great weekend.
You too.
Thanks, Bryan. Take care.